Reason is the certainty of consciousness that it is all reality. Thus does idealism express its notion. Just as consciousness that comes on the scene as reason possesses that certainty directly in itself, so too does idealism give direct expression to that certainty. I am I, in the sense that the I, which is an object for me, is the sole object, is all reality and all that is present. Here, the I that is object for me is not merely an empty object in general, as it is for self-consciousness as such, nor is it, as in free self-consciousness, merely an object that withdraws itself from other objects which retain their worth alongside it. On the contrary, it is for self-consciousness an object such that any other object whatever is a non-being. But self-consciousness is all reality, not merely for itself, but also in itself, only through becoming this reality, or rather through demonstrating itself to be such. It demonstrates itself to be this along the path in which first in the dialectical movement of meaning, perceiving and understanding, otherness as an intrinsic being vanishes. Then in the movement through the independence of consciousness and lordship and bondage, through the conception of freedom, through the liberation that comes from skepticism and the struggle for absolute liberation by the consciousness divided against itself, otherness, insofar as it is only for consciousness, vanishes for consciousness itself. There appeared two aspects, one after the other. One in which the essence or the true had for consciousness the determinateness of being, the other in which it had the determinateness of being only for consciousness. But the two reduced themselves to a single truth, that is, what is, or the in itself only is insofar as it is for consciousness, and what is for consciousness is also in itself, or has intrinsic being. The consciousness, which is this truth, has this path behind it and has forgotten it and comes on the scene immediately as reason. In other words, this reason which comes immediately on the scene appears only as the certainty of that truth. Thus, it merely asserts that it is all reality, but does not itself comprehend this. For it is along that forgotten path that this immediately expressed assertion is comprehended. And equally, anyone who has not trodden this path finds this assertion incomprehensible when he hears it in this pure form, although he does, as a matter of fact, make the assertion himself in a concrete shape. That is, the assertion is implicit in his behavior. Hegel is beginning this section, Reason, with some pretty major claims. He's already done quite a bit of that, and now he's going to provide us a bit more context for the claims that are being made. He's actually helping us to see that, in a certain sense, idealism, the way that it's been framed in what we're going to talk about as reason, as immediately coming on the scene, seems rather difficult to accept. The idealist is making some pretty major declarations in saying that reason or consciousness is all reality. So we want to see how that pans out, what's actually going on with that. And what's going to be particularly important is this forgotten path that we have just traced through all of these previous paragraphs that we've done all this discussion and commentary of. Remember, too, that it's very important for Hegelian philosophy that while we do leave previous states of consciousness behind in the sense that there's no more development going on with them, we don't totally leave them behind as in the old metaphor of throwing away the ladder once we've climbed up. Rather, you could think of it as bringing all the essential stuff along. So let's start where Hegel starts here, with him talking about the notion of idealism. What is the notion or the concept of idealism? Idealism is a philosophical standpoint, but also, as he's going to say a little bit later at the end of this section, a practical standpoint as well. Well, it's to say that reason as consciousness is in fact all reality, that it becomes certain of itself as being all reality. So what does that mean then? That's why when you make claims like that, people are reluctant to accept them. They say, well, you think that your consciousness is actually all of reality? That's not quite what Hegel is saying here, even though the language does seem to suggest that. So let's look at what he's got here. He says, just as consciousness that comes on the scene as reason possesses that certainty directly in itself, so too does idealism give direct expression to that certainty. And what is that certainty? It's expressed in this I am I. He goes on and he says, it's I am I in the sense that the I, which is an object for me, is the sole object, is all reality and all that is present. So, does that mean that I, as in Gregory Sadler, is the only thing that is reality, that you are somehow, say, a figment of my imagination, or, everything around me falls into that? No, that's not what he's saying. The I there, the pure I, as we're going to see developed in these later paragraphs, has to be sort of drawn out. Right now, a pure I is sort of an empty signifier, you might say. So he says, the I that is object for me is not merely an empty object in general, as it is for self-consciousness as such, right? Self-consciousness at the beginning doesn't have that much to work with. It needs content. We still need content here. So what is it then? He says, nor is it, as in free self-consciousness, merely an object that withdraws itself from other objects which retain their worth alongside it. So when he's talking about free self-consciousness, he's talking about the development that took place in the lordship and bondage or master-slave dialectic after the struggle to the death. And he's talking about the developments that we've just gone through in terms of Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. Consciousness trying to make sense out of the fact that it is indeed free, and also at the same time does not yet possess its truth. Or when it does possess its truth, it loses its certainty, as Hegel will tell us. So in these previous stages, before we get to here, right, in the path that we've been tracing out, when we said I am I, which we said back in these earlier sections, it sort of effaced things, right? And we saw there were problems with that. Same thing here. The I am I is sort of empty, but at the same time it's another being that can also say I am I, that is opposed to it. And we saw that play itself out in the unhappy consciousness in particular. There's an estrangement that goes on within consciousness. So he says it's not these. On the contrary, it is for self-consciousness an object such that any other object, whatever, is a non-being. So the I is an object for itself. In saying I am I, I'm not just acting as subject, I'm also acting as object. But the I there is, you might say, extending into the entire universe. Not just the universe of perception, by the way, too, or sensibility, but literally everything. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness is all reality, not merely for itself, but also in itself, only through becoming this reality, or through demonstrating itself to be such. So this is a really key point. It is one thing for self-consciousness to assert in a, you might say, naive or aggressive against the world kind of stance. Everything belongs to me. It would also be similar to a sort of a narcissistic circling around. A narcissist would not be the same thing as what Hegel is talking about here in reason, because the narcissist is never going to make any progress. If they do, they quit being a narcissist, right? Or at least become less of one. Instead, what's happening is there has to be a development that takes place. He talks in terms here of a demonstration. That means it's working out for itself what is actually going on, what it itself is, and what it's doing. So he says, it demonstrates itself to be this along a path. What path? The path that it traced out in the previous stages of the dialectic. He says, in which first, in the dialectical movement of meaning, okay, so we have meaning, perceiving, understanding, and in those those dialectics, in those developments that took place, building off of each other, otherness is treated as intrinsic being, and over again, what we think to be intrinsic being doesn't really have intrinsic being, whether it's the object that we gesture towards or try to name, the thing that we think has immediacy in terms of sense certainty, whether it's the thing that we perceive, the thing with its qualities, right? None of that turns out to be purely stable ground that we can rest on. Or even the understanding itself, understood, notice a little thing there, circularity, understood as a faculty that is able to grasp something that goes beyond mere perception or sensibility. It's able to grasp, you might say, the metaphysical ground. Well, that metaphysical ground turns out to be a shifting one in these laws. So otherness keeps on vanishing. And some people have expressed some frustration as they go through those sections, understandably so, because it seems like everything turns into a vanishing point. What is Hegel actually holding on to? Well, we do hold on to some of this. You might say there's a residue of what we've passed through. So that's the first stage. That's consciousness, right? That's an entire section. Now we have self-consciousness. And Hegel goes on in this passage, and he says, here we go. It demonstrates itself to be this along the path, right? Then in the movement through the independence of consciousness in lordship and bondage, through the conception of freedom, through the liberation that comes from skepticism and its struggle for absolute liberation by the consciousness divided against itself. What happens to otherness? Otherness becomes something for consciousness, but it vanishes for consciousness itself by the time that we get finished with it, right? So there's this constant play of trying to, the self and the other, trying to grasp what the other actually is. And all of this was a very important set of developments. So he says, there appeared two aspects, one after the other, one in which the essence or the true had for consciousness the determinateness of being, the other in which it had the determinateness of being only for consciousness. So, determinateness of being, that is the in itself, and being for consciousness, that is the for consciousness, or in the case of consciousness, for itself, right? And now Hegel is going to bring these two together in what he calls a single truth. A truth that has two sides to it, but where the two sides are supposed to be melded together, reflecting different aspects of the same thing. The in itself is for consciousness. When we say, and we've seen this said before, right? We already saw this back in this section, the consciousness section. When you try to postulate something out there that would be in itself and totally opaque to or resistant to consciousness, how are you conceptualizing that? How are you even talking about that? How are you imagining it? You're doing that in your consciousness, right? The mere fact that I can talk about this with you means that you are also thinking about it, and I'm thinking about it, and Hegel's thinking about it. So the in itself is in itself, but also for consciousness. That's one side. What is for consciousness is also in itself. A lot of times people want to, this is a little bit of a digression here, but it's kind of important. When we talk about idealism, idealism has come to mean something quite different in modern parlance than it did in, earlier times when Hegel was using it, taking the term, from others before him, like Kant, for example. And a lot of people associate it with a kind of, fuzzy-headed, you're living in the realm of ideas, you're not practical, you're not grounded in things that really are, like books or neckties or chalkboards, things that you can touch, things that you can say facts about, right? And what we forget in that, this is really one of the great insights of the Hegelian philosophy, is that ideas are also realities. Ideas have to be drawn out. The notion, when it first comes on the scene, is not fully developed. But ideas have a kind of power. You can unfold them into reality. And it's not just an application of our thought onto reality. Our thinking is a real thing. Our thinking is itself part of reality. It's not something totally opposed to it, or, it's kind of sort of a hazy picture of it. The foreconsciousness has some in itself to it. And so Hegel is insisting that we recognize this. So he says the consciousness which is this truth, which the consciousness that grasps this single truth, has this path behind it. Here's the problem. It's forgotten that path. Because, you could just turn to this page of the book, right? And once you actually start doing the sorts of things that reason corresponds to, both conceptually and historically, you might well forget about all this stuff and leave it behind and say, this is the real stuff that I'm interested in. I'm just going to focus on this. The problem with that is then when reason comes on the scene immediately as such, he says, reason which comes immediately on the scene appears only as the certainty of that truth. It merely asserts that it is all reality. It's one thing to assert it, and it's another thing to be able to adequately explain it, or demonstrate it, or to make sense of it to oneself. And so Hegel is conceding that when idealism comes on the scene, or reason comes on the scene, and forgets about all this stuff behind it, it's saying stuff that sounds kind of crazy. And that's okay, because that is itself part of the historical development here. He says, it's along that forgotten path that this immediately expressed assertion is comprehended. You want to understand, he's saying, you understand this assertion here, then you need to keep this other stuff in mind. Now, what he says to end this is very interesting. He says, anyone who has not trodden this path finds this assertion incomprehensible when he hears it in its pure form, although he does, as a matter of fact, make the assertion himself in a concrete shape. Miller has here as a gloss on that, the assertion is implicit in his behavior. And that is worth keeping in mind. I'm not going to say much about that right now, but keep that in mind when we get to later portions of reason, where we're looking at, for example, the dialectic between pleasure and necessity, where we're talking about practical affairs, where we're talking about practical reason and action. The idealism that does not demonstrate that path, but starts off with this assertion, is therefore too a pure assertion, which does not comprehend its own self, nor can it make itself comprehensible to others. It proclaims an immediate certainty which is confronted by other immediate certainties, which have, however, been lost on that same path. With equal right, therefore, the assertions of these other certainties, too, take their place alongside the assertion of that certainty. Reason appeals to the self-consciousness of each and every consciousness. I am I. My object and my essence is I. And no one will deny reason this truth. But in basing itself on this appeal, reason sanctions the truth of the other certainty. That is, that there is for me an other, that an other than I is object and essence for me, or in that I am object and essence to myself. I am only so by drawing back from the other altogether and taking my place as an actuality alongside it. Not until reason comes on the scene as a reflection from this opposite certainty does its affirmation about itself present itself not merely as a certainty and an assertion, but as truth, and not merely alongside other truths, but as the sole truth. Its immediate appearance on the scene is the abstraction of its actual presence, the essence and the in itself of which is the absolute notion, that is, the movement which has brought it into being. Consciousness will determine its relationship to otherness or its object in various ways, according to the precise stage it has reached in the development of the world spirit into self-consciousness. How it immediately finds and determines itself and its object at any time, or the way in which it is for itself, depends on what it has already become, or what it already is in itself. Now in paragraph 234, we're going to see Hegel bringing back in this dyadic relationship between the self and the other in a very explicit way, one that's quite important for understanding how it is that reason works. And you know, I said just a few paragraphs back and in the last paragraph that some of what he's saying, you know, if you take it the wrong way, sounds pretty crazy. I am all reality. That sounds rather strange to say, but that is something that the idealist is maintaining. The question is, and this is a very important question for any sort of idealism, how do you take account of there being multiple, you could say, centers of agency, of development, of consciousness, right? And this is what he's touching on here. He's not providing you with a complete solution here, but he is framing the problem in a very explicit way. So, he says, the idealism that doesn't demonstrate the path but starts off with this assertion is therefore to a pure assertion which doesn't comprehend its own self. Consciousness does not really understand itself in just making the assertion, I'm everything, because it's forgotten its previous path that we just talked about in the last paragraph. It says, it also can't make itself comprehensible to others. And it's not just the self that's in this boat, it's any other that's also doing this at the same time. So he says, it proclaims an immediate certainty which is confronted by other immediate certainties. So in proclaiming its own immediate certainty, it has to take account of the fact that there are other immediate certainties, and I've only got one on the board, but we could think of an entire world of other immediate certainties that we could go back and forth from. This is where idealism starts to seem a little less crazy, right? Because it's not saying I am the only conscious being in the world. As a matter of fact, there's all these other conscious beings, and now the question is, how am I connected with them, and how are they connected with me? So if we're all doing this immediate certainty, right, just sort of imagining this, he says, each of these have been lost on the same path. With equal right, the assertion of these other certainties take their place alongside the assertion of that certainty. So these are both kind of on an equal footing with each other, right? And, you know, this immediate certainty is saying to itself, I am I. This immediate certainty over there can also say to itself, I am I. And meaning by that, I am all reality. I am all reality. And they're not saying we're both all reality together. It's not competing at this point, but there is a tension there. And how do I see the other? Well, that I is also I. Now, is that I in the sense of being me? Or is that I in the sense of being him or her? You know, this is where things start to get sticky, don't they? And we see the importance of this function of the I. That gets talked about quite a bit by later thinkers, you know, ranging from Sartre to Lacan. You know, we can do a lot of plays on words with this, but I is kind of a function. That's a key idea here. So he goes on and he says, reason appeals to the self-consciousness of each and every consciousness. I am I, my object and my essence is I. So the question is, okay, where is the object and the essence? Am I the object and essence for myself, but not for anybody else? Or is this other I over here also an object and essence for me, something of concern, something within the purview of my reason? It's hard for me to extricate myself totally from them, right? So he says, no one will deny reason this truth. In basing itself on this, the reason sanctions the truth of the other certainty. That there is for me an other. That an other than I is object and essence for me. So this is very important, isn't it? I am object and essence for myself in saying I am I. But if I'm going to do that for myself, I have to also concede it over here for this other being, which turns out to also be my object and essence. But that means that my object and essence aren't totally in myself or in my consciousness. And, we saw how this can, lead to all sorts of interesting dynamics back in the self-consciousness section, right? And things to work through. So that's coming up again here, but in terms of reason. So he says, this is what the other certainty is, right? This other certainty is not just the other certainty over here, it's a certainty about that other certainty. And he says, here we go. I am only so by drawing back from the other altogether and taking my place as an actuality alongside it. Right? So there's a sort of removal. It says, not until reason comes on the scene as a reflection from this opposite certainty does its affirmation about itself present itself not merely as a certainty and as an assertion, but as truth. So what we're trying to get at here is, again, not just having certainty, but the truth of reason. And that is going to require some sort of process of reflection that is taking the other certainty as object in essence, as the other, into consideration as something that is part of my consciousness. Now that's kind of a tall order, isn't it? But we're going to see this worked out. So he says, the immediate appearance on the scene is the abstraction of its actual presence. The immediate appearance of what? Of reason on the scene. The essence and the in itself of which is the absolute notion. That is the movement which has brought it into being. What is that movement? That movement is this path. So, it says, consciousness will determine its relation to otherness or its object in various ways. Depending on what? Depending, here's where Hegel says, on the state, according to the precise stage it has reached in the development of world spirit into self-consciousness. So, which stage in the dialectic we have managed to reach is going to determine how we relate ourselves to the other, or, if you like, the object, which is also ourself or a self. All of this depends on how far along we've gotten and whether or not we've left so much behind that we don't realize where we've come. Very interesting insight here, isn't it? So he says, how it immediately finds and determines itself, and its object at any time, or the way in which it is for itself, depends on what it has already become, or what it already is in itself. The for itself is how it understands itself, right? But also how it understands itself in relation to its object, and that is based on where it has been, what it has become, as Hegel is saying. So there's a certain element of what you could call, let's call it, to use Sartre's term, facticity, or a certain historical mooring, if you like, and you can't really get away from that. You can't jumpstart beyond previous stages of the dialectic that are not previous for you, but which would be previous for somebody else at a further stage. You actually have to progress through them. And if Hegel is right, as he said in the preface, that we've actually forgotten much of the previous stages, we also need to sort of bring that back into the picture in order for us to understand where we currently are in relation to ourselves and in relation to the other.